And it would seem almost impossible to do a symposium where we're trying to broaden the dialogue without hearing an industry perspective as well. As someone said in our planning team, Antonio Banderas, I think, who left her, that in Texas, 120% of the people are employed in fossil fuel industry. It certainly seems that way at times. Sabrina, we welcome you and look forward to learning industry perspective from you this afternoon. Let's welcome Sabrina.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We really do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it has been, we've had a long engagement with the Reverend Bill Simplotsky-Jarman and others in the faith community, and it's been very important for us. We've learned a lot, and it was helpful for us to share our perspective as well, because the diversity of viewpoints is what helps all of us come to a stronger decision, whether that's about divestment or capital allocation within our company, or just about anything probably. My own perspective is I'll just give you a little bit of history because I think it's helpful for the conversation. I've been in the oil and gas industry for 34 years. I came into this role straight out of college. I'm a civil engineer by background with a degree in groundwater, and so I flow through porous media, right? It works. So I love the industry. I didn't know how long I would stay, and I've stayed a long time with one company because I've been very proud to work for them and have had the great joy of working in assets and field operations that had a high regard for safety and environmental performance. So for me, those two things go together. The industry and safety and environmental performance are part and parcel of the same thing. When I think about the diverse viewpoints that are important, I think about in 2004, I realized that I'd lived in Houston for a while, and we kind of live in a bubble in the industry in Houston, and we hear a lot of things from our colleagues, and I was moving into the field of sustainability as a full-time role, and I cared deeply about doing that well. And I decided to go back to get a master's in sustainable business, and I decided to do that in Seattle. And it's different, And the school that I went to is about 30% big companies, big government types, and about 30% environmental and social activists, and about 30% entrepreneurs. And it was a very, very healthy place for me to be. And when I think about how they brought us together to work together for the next 3 years, the dean the very first night said, "It's all good work." And so part of what I wanted to talk about today was the good work that each of us individually can do around climate change and around reducing our environmental footprint, as well as I want to share with you some work that we as an industry and we as a company, Conoco Phillips, are doing around climate change, specifically in greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I'll get started. And first, some of you, either individually or collectively, as we know, are shareholders. So I want to be sure that if you don't want to read all of this in teeny tiny print on the screen, I'll give you the headline, which is, I may make forward-looking statements, and if so, you should look at our SEC documents and so forth to be fully informed as to your investment decisions. It's required. Yeah, you knew we would have a PowerPoint. I know it's so very predictable. But let's talk a little bit about some of the key things that I thought would be helpful today to talk about in terms of carbon asset risk are to look at the premise a little bit of divestment. Oh, hang on, that's a different thing. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk first about energy supply and use, and then we'll talk a little bit about the premise of divestment and the premise of the carbon bubble or carbon asset risk. And then we'll talk about my company's understanding of that concept and how we think it is applicable to our work and some areas that we think are flawed in that premise. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of engagement and continuing to work together to do things well. So I was kind of excited because I thought, okay, I'm in Houston. Maybe there'll be engineers in the room, and this is pretty exciting. So for those of you in the room, get excited. It's a Carnot diagram. For the rest of us who might not have looked at it in several years or ever, there's some really key parts of this, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details, but I wanted to point out some really big pieces of the energy puzzle or the energy conundrum, because we live in a world where energy is super important and it's a conundrum. It's a conundrum in terms of our environmental footprint, and it's a conundrum in terms of how we work with communities and how energy is delivered to the world. So on the left, you see the main sources of energy, which include oil and gas and coal and renewables and other types of industry. And that bottom part includes everything from burning wood in a fireplace for heat, wood stoves, wood cooking. It includes biofuels and so forth. So that's a hydropower, it's a broad category. And then in the center, you see that a lot of that energy is used for electric power generation. And another big part of that energy is used for our end uses, which would include transportation, our housing, heating and cooling, industry, and so forth. So when you think about what energy does for us in the world, it spans a pretty broad range. Those of us who live in Houston, it would be hard to do that without a car. I have a mom who successfully did that, but it isn't easy. So we kind of love our automobiles. And so you can see how different types of communities would access and utilize energy differently, but all of us are in this puzzle of how do we get and use energy. And one of the things that I find one of the biggest opportunities for ministry, because I was in a retreat one time and they said we should all do the ministry between our own 2 feet. And that was very powerful for me. I think there is a lot of opportunity that way. So this 4.3 billion TOEs up here is wasted energy. It's energy lost through the system as it works its way from, in the case of oil and gas, a gas well, whether to the extent that it has methane emissions, to the extent that we capture those and get them in the pipeline, then through the pipeline, then into the distribution system in a city where that natural gas is delivered for heating and other uses. So I think an opportunity we all have is around reducing wastefulness and looking at energy efficiency. So then as we get into actually thinking about carbon asset risk, there's a lot of numbers in this, and there's a lot of math, and some of you have probably delved into it with great glee, and others have probably shied away from it, and I think that's good as well. A couple things that I think are important as it relates to divestment are to know that the 50 top publicly traded oil and gas companies only have about 17% or so of the world's remaining reserves, and that will yield over time only about 6% of the emissions. So the total industry, and the rest of that is coal and national oil and gas companies who own the bulk of the remaining reserves. It's also important that the international oil companies or the independent oil companies produce at a faster rate. So it's likely that there is headroom for oil and gas companies to continue to produce for quite a very long time, even within the 2-degree IPCC scenarios, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So it's good to get into the numbers and to try to understand those nuances so that you have a full and complete picture of what the options are for how you faithfully engage in the carbon asset risk and climate change dilemma. This one is, these are the International Energy Association. These are 3 different scenarios. The shortest bar is how we would limit our energy use under very carbon-constrained scenarios. And then you have a middle one, and you have one that's closer to how things are today. So you can see that the total fossil fuel part of that pie reduces over time and reduces more stringently under more severely carbon-constrained scenarios. And in 2040 and 2050 and 2100, in all of those, in the 2-degree scenarios through IPCC, the IEA, the International Energy Association, and other modeling efforts, oil and gas continue to play an important role into the long-term future, which really means that we have an important role to play in continuing to produce and deliver energy to the world, and the growth of that energy is likely to be most in the developing world. We have a continued responsibility to do that efficiently and responsibly, and we have a continued challenge to meet as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions. So when we look at how do we do that, and how do we predict what we should do as a company, how do we know how much of our emissions we need to reduce, that's a genuine challenge as well. And this particular slide shows different potential policy outcomes, all the way from business as usual. If everybody keeps doing what they're doing now and the rest of the world develops the way it's developing, the way that we developed in the West, then the emissions will go up, the greenhouse gas emissions will go up as to the black line. The Paris talks are going to work very hard to get to that green line or below, and the IPCC 2-degree scenarios say that we need to go even further. So everything that governments are expected to turn in Paris will not meet the level that the scientists are telling society is a safe level to be. So I want to be clear about what that challenge is. It's also challenging to change the infrastructure, and you've seen that as it relates to automobiles, and if you drive a compressed natural gas vehicle, that's harder to get filled up than if you drive a regular gasoline vehicle, and so forth. And it's also true for renewables as well. So fossil fuels have a challenge on the greenhouse gas footprint side. Renewables have a challenge primarily as it relates to land use. So this particular slide just shows what would be needed to deliver a gigaton of CO2 improvement by replacing with more renewables. So for example, the bottom one is the solar one, so it takes something 12 times the size of Los Angeles in terms of the physical footprint on today's solar technology. Now, solar is improving. There's some very interesting things going on as it relates to roof tiles and paint for sidewalks, and I think there's some very interesting technology developments that are likely to play out in solar, and also wind, and also in the fossil fuel world in oil and gas. So I think part of the concern around oil and gas companies comes from the carbon footprint that we have, the physical greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by our product. And an important thing to know about that is that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the emissions, somewhere between 70 and 90% of the emissions are produced at the tailpipe. So all of the emissions from drilling the well, discovering the well, doing the completion work, putting it in a pipeline, transporting it, and getting it to the vehicle is somewhere between 10 and 30% of the emissions. And then what happens in the vehicle is another 70 to 90. So that's why CAFE standards and energy efficiency are, and how we drive, and whether or not we carpool on I-10 and all those kinds of questions are actually really relevant and really important. So I wanted to have some context around that. And then oil and gas companies are really doing very interesting work in terms of reducing their environmental footprint. They're engaged in policy discussions. They're making physical reductions. You'll see in their sustainable development reports companies talking about how their activities and how their technology has changed over time. And each piece of that are something that will help them to compete better in a carbon-constrained world. And when we think about, as a company, what we need to do, we want to be successful even in a carbon-constrained world, even in a severely carbon-constrained world, and we're working on how to do that. And then there's a comment as well about carbon capture and storage. The industry is active in that as well. And then if we move to Conoco Phillips's performance, maybe not. Let's just jump right to our action plan. So the way that Conoco Phillips structures and drives our performance is through a comprehensive action plan that looks at how do we understand our footprint, how do we know the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we're producing, what should we do to manage our operations effectively and put as much natural gas in the pipeline as we can and not emit it to the air, and what do we do to manage the future risks, carbon constraints and other types of risks, and then what do we do to engage others so that we have effective dialogue on the topic and the challenges of what our industry needs to bring to the table as we play our part. So I've just highlighted the areas of our plan that speak to this question of how are we engaging with shareholders around the questions of divestment, and what kind of scenario planning, what kind of planning are we doing for a carbon-constrained environment. So we have successfully delivered quite a lot on that action plan. Our first action plan was from 2008 to 2014, and then we recently updated our plan and set some new goals and targets, and the plan now has 70 some odd actions that relate to each of the business units and what they're planning to do. We have year on year since 2009 reduced our greenhouse gas footprint by about 1 million tons. on a BOU, business as usual basis. So we've taken our expected forecast and we've cut that by about 1 million tons in terms of what we actually delivered. And by doing that, every year since 2009, we've held our emissions nearly flat as we've grown the company. And employees are very proud to have done that, because normally in an oil and gas situation, if you're growing the company and you're growing your production, you're growing your emissions. But we've been able to flatten that curve because of technology advancements as well as just operational improvements. And we've done that and made money doing it. So the improvements that we've made have allowed us to sell more oil and gas as well. We do that on a globally prioritized basis, so all the business units send in the investments that they could make to reduce emissions, and we prioritize that on a global basis, and we make investments to try to get the most reduction that we can for the smallest amount of money, because that's the game. That's what you want to do, is spend the money and deliver the biggest emission reductions that you can. And then finally, we are supporting new solutions. I mentioned CCS. We've had some projects in the past in CCS. The project that we have now is in our Lost Cabin gas plant. We reduce emissions about 700,000 tons a year by transporting that gas and having another company use it for enhanced oil recovery. And then we also have investments in a very, very interesting company called Skyonics, which actually has a plant down in San Antonio. I don't know if anybody's from San Antonio, but that plant is poised to deliver from CO2. They're going to make several sellable products like hydrochloric acid, some limestone products, and so forth. So they're looking at what does it take to actually reuse CO2 in a way that makes products instead of emissions. So we're trying to engage in some very interesting technology plays as well. When we talk about carbon asset risk, we want to look at our long-term reserves and understand their potential vulnerability to carbon-constrained scenarios. And we want to do that across a number of different methodologies so that we can talk to our shareholders and others who are interested and make sure that we understand how our portfolio will be robust in that kind of environment. We put updated information in our Sustainable Development Report. We've had shareholder dialogues and other stakeholder dialogues about that. And then we've been talking within the industry as well. And we summarize that on our Sustainable Development Report in 2 charts that look like this. And one of the things that has been very important, and we've gotten a lot of very positive feedback about, is that curve on the right shows the series of trajectories of the IPCC 2-degree scenarios. And the 3 out of our 4 carbon-constrained scenarios reach the IPCC 2-degree levels in global emissions over the right time frame. So we are stress testing the portfolio to the standards that IPCC has demonstrated in their emissions planning. And then on the left-hand side, what you see is what we had a low demand scenario in our overall corporate scenarios, and we extracted that, and then we explored a range of things that included both the pace of technology advancement. So if you think about what could make carbon constraints come faster and steeper or slower and more gradual, and it revolves around a couple things. It revolves around the pace of technology advancement in renewables and other types of technology, and it involves the pace and severity of government action. So we tried to be prepared across a wide range of both of those 2 axes so that we would test the portfolio robustly. And what we learned was that our portfolio does stand up to that kind of rigor and that kind of testing, and we'll continue to take action based on what we learned from this work. This, I will leave with you all a bunch of links in case you want to read more about what our company is doing, and we'll put on there the IPCA, the Road to Paris work that IPCA has done. For those of you in the oil and gas industry, that's the Oil and Gas Industry Social and Environmental Best Practices Group. It's a global group, and that material is very helpful and very factual. They're not an advocacy organization. They don't have a political, axe to grind, but it is a helpful set of information. And then we heard a little bit earlier several folks talking about also the public policy choices around how the U.S. and how other countries in the world are managing climate change, and what does a good policy look like. And several years ago, in about 2007, 2008, our company, as you may know, was very engaged in thinking about legislation around climate change in the U.S. and worked very hard as a part of a group to look at and design what that legislation might look like. And we caught a lot of flack from that within our industry in some cases, and had got some compliments for it too. So I think that's what it's like. When you engage in difficult topics, and you guys have found this through your work as well, I'm sure, then you hear different viewpoints on how that's going. So what we did is, at that time, we came out with these policy principles, and they've stood the test of time quite well. We think that effective policy has to be market-based. It has to be both environmentally effective and economically effective. We don't want to disadvantage those who have struggles to afford energy. At the same time, we know that environmental effectiveness is an important part of this type of policy work. So we've been engaged in climate change policy and the design of effective policy in the U.S., in Australia, in Canada, in the EU, and in other parts of the world as those conversations become active. I should pause, like in the middle of this somewhere, and say, any questions? Instead of waiting to the end, which seems like a very long time. Okay, yes. Pause it. Sorry, is it possible?
Zero flaring
To zero
operation
flaring, okay.
upstream.
Um,
I'm sorry.
yes, yes. Go, actually, you can repeat the question.
So
That's even
my
better.
question, one of the items that was listed on how they're reducing their carbon footprint was a reduction in flaring, and I asked the question, how's that going, and how big of a factor is that for Conoco, and importantly, is it technically feasible to go to zero flare operation in shale gas operations?
Thanks. For us as a company, flaring is about 2% of our total greenhouse gas emissions, so it's a fairly small piece of our total pie. That said, it's a really important one to work on. It's one that communities are frustrated by. It's not pretty, and one of the areas where we've worked really hard on that is in the Bakken. And what's happened with the downturn in the industry, which has changed so many things and brought a whole bunch of different challenges, is that the pace of drilling and completing wells in the Bakken has slowed enough that the infrastructure is catching up. So it is possible for flaring to be significantly reduced in operations when you have pipelines ready to connect to the well as it starts producing and things like that. Flaring is also used sometimes as a safety issue, and that those kind of occasional instances would be harder to completely eliminate. But certainly, the smaller the flaring, the better. Yes?
I was curious about the stage of development of the Skyonyx project in San Antonio. I know they received a fairly large Department of Energy grant, I think, last year.
Yeah. But what was the question? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm curious about the stage of development of that project.
I hadn't been in touch with it in a while, and just a couple days ago I went out and looked, and there's a video, and it's a plant. I mean, it's a big physical plant now, and I was stunned because I keep thinking of it as a pilot project, but it's going to be a commercial plant very soon. So we'll get to see how it does economically and go from there. It's really come a long way. Anything else? Should we go on a bit and give you thinking time? Okay. Oh, here we go. So actually, I just circling back at the end. I meant to pause like halfway, but that didn't happen. So here we are back at the end saying, okay, here we are in the energy conundrum. We have these sources of energy, all of which have challenges associated with them. Fossil fuels have the challenge of greenhouse gas emissions significantly. There's a lot of work going on in that area. Engagement is helpful, has been helpful in that work. And then we saw the transformation in how energy comes into electricity and end uses like automobile transportation and other types of transport, housing, industry, and so forth. And then we touched on wastefulness and how to eliminate things like methane emissions and flaring and things which really waste energy that would be better used productively, and thinking about things like CAFE standards and other opportunities to improve the efficiency of energy use. So there we go. Now we really do have time for questions. They said leave plenty of time for questions, so I did. Or just your perspective. I mean, the best part about this is just hearing everybody's thoughts on the subject.
So, whoa. Let's say that technology development in green energy comes along maybe faster than some of the predictions, because it feels like there's some stuff that's getting closer. And the role of oil and gas 20 years from now is, let's say, well, it's a part of the total, significantly smaller than it is now, and maybe there's not much growth. How do you see Conoco Phillips' role in a world that where oil and gas is playing a diminished, or has a diminished presence in the total energy picture?
I mean, we have a long history. We're 130 some odd years old, and we'd like to be around a lot longer. So we have an intention to be here for the long haul. We think we're doing the things that it takes to do that. And it was interesting, we as Reverend Simplotsky-Jarman mentioned earlier, we had some conversations today with some faith-based investors and talked about carbon asset risk. And one of the things that the economist and director of climate change in my group talked about was, in some ways, the downturn of the industry has given us a bit of a test run on what happens when prices drop, which is not unlike what happens when you have oversupply, in the sense that suddenly we have to react very quickly. And so the work that we do on scenario planning and the work that we've done understanding our assets has helped us react quickly in the downturn. So we think we have the processes and systems in place as a company to look at emerging trends, to understand the trajectory, to be thoughtful about how fast things are happening, and to be engaged in that so that we can react as we need to when we see things changing.
Hi. On a similar note, do you see a future, or could you see a future, where Conoco Phillips produces no fossil fuels and is instead an alternative energies company solely?
I mean, right now, we're an oil and gas company, and we think that's an important role for us to play. And we think that that will be important for a long time. My mom taught me never say never, so, I don't know what that might look like in the future, but we're really a producing company, and we're not really even we're not a utility provider. We're not in the business of electric generation, for example. So it's so that's why you see us using investments like Skyonics and things which feel closer to our core skills and knowledge, and the way that we might diversify our portfolio might be different than how other companies would do it. But we think there's a long-term role for oil and gas, and we think as a company that's responsibly developing oil and gas, we have a part to play in that.
Sabrina, I think I'm remembering this from the early part of your presentation. You said something about 38 companies responsible for 6% of production. Can you say a little more about that? And then specifically, how that relates to the Carbon Tracker 200 or whatever with that. One of the things within our denomination that is being talked about, looked at, is the potential of divesting. How would divesting from those 200 companies impact the big picture?
Yeah, not very much. I mean,
okay, that's really what I'd like to.
Yeah, and the reality is, so that the 6% emissions number includes all fossil fuels. So that includes oil and gas and coal. And so the publicly traded, in other words, the ones you might own stock in, right, as an organization, the publicly traded companies own a relatively small percentage of those remaining fossil fuel reserves. So divestment can, be interesting, but it's not going to have a big impact on the actual emissions profile. So we think, obviously, that there are better ways to affect global emissions. So tell me when I can't hardly, okay, that's it, okay. So, and we have, you know, this, we took, basically what we did when we tried to, we used publicly available information to try to scrub this down and analyze it. It comes out of the carbon tracker report for the carbon bubble part of it, and it comes out of WoodMac, IEA, IHS CIRA, and the Bernstein report. The Bernstein report is quite an interesting one. It comes out of those four pieces of work externally that help us understand who owns what in terms of remaining reserves. And I think it's an important thing for us to keep learning about and keep working on. Yeah? Is that potential or proven reserves? That's future proven reserves. Yeah, not including potential reserves. And another part of it that is important is the, you know, when you think about the reserve to production ratio, I mean, part of the question about how fast are we producing reserves, and therefore, if government changed things really quickly, would we be in a bind, right? And so the average reserve to production ratio for publicly traded companies is somewhere like between, you know, the last time I looked, it was something like somewhere between 10 and 13 years, something like that. And so what that means is they will produce all of their proven reserves over a relatively short period of time. And as you know, oil and gas, as it's produced, you know, each well comes down a decline curve, and you keep drilling to try to continue to deliver the volumes that are wanted. And so that's another piece of the puzzle that I think is interesting. So in terms of the impact of divestment of oil and gas producers is a very small impact. Yes, here and then here.
Who controls the remaining 94% of the fossil fuel emissions?
Well, coal is a big part of it, and the national oil companies are a big part of it. National oil companies, government-owned oil companies, are a significant part of the total future reserves owned by oil and gas companies. Yes?
We also need to keep in mind that these major international fossil fuel companies are involved in the production of plastics, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural chemicals. And so if we want to lose our voice at stockholder meetings, what better way than not to be able to speak to pharmaceuticals and plastics and agricultural chemicals?
Now, and some oil and gas companies do have an integrated portfolio that goes all the way into chemicals. Conoco Phillips doesn't. We're just an oil and gas producer, but certainly some companies span a larger part of that value chain. Yes?
Thank you for a very good presentation, Sabrina. You talked about policy development in your work there. Could you expand a little bit on that, especially on market-based mechanisms and what you're looking for there?
I mean, one of the things that, you know, people always say, tax, cap and trade, you know, what should things look like? And our experience of that is that the details of legislation really matter. So in 2009, I got to read the whole Waxman-Markey bill and the whole Kerry Lieberman bill, and 734 pages on the former and 1,200 some odd on the latter. And the details of that really matter. So we believe that there could be multiple frameworks that could be designed in an effective way, that there are different ways to do that. But that the market basis is important because that's what drives the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. You want to create a system, if your goal is to reduce emissions, you want to create a system that gets the most emissions for every dollar you spend. Thoughts?
Thank you very much.
You bet.